Hello, good morning. It will be my great pleasure to be your librarian today. I work in the Total Library. You might have heard of it. Okay. You might have heard of it. It's otherwise known as the Library of Babylon. The Total Library contains every work that could possibly be written. This is meant quite literally. This is what the typical work in the Total Library looks like. As you can imagine, the first generations in the library, they despaired at ever finding anything meaningful in this endless array of verbal cacophonies, farragios, and meaningless babblings. The halls were filled with mystery cults, madness, and sky burial. This link is real, by the way. There is an online Library of Babylon that you can access. You're very lucky to have a portal to the library. Many worlds do not. It is not known whether the library is really infinite or not. In the millennia since it was discovered, we have worked tirelessly to map and organize it, but we have yet to reach any kind of limit or boundary. And we have not yet found a single repeated work. One of the early poets of the library wrote these words, Let heaven exist, though my place be in hell. Let me be outraged and annihilated, but for one instant, in one being, let your enormous library be justified. I'm happy to say that in the time since these words were written, we have made great progress. To give you a concrete example, this book contains only the letter A. So far, we have found billions like it, with a tiny variation, a letter E hiding in the pages somewhere, or a letter O. And this is just for A. For every letter, there are unthinkable numbers of works that contain 99% the same letter. We faithfully organize and categorize all that we find, and we have made great progress. We have started developing the tools we need to challenge immensity. One of the wonders of the modern library are the categorization systems. Each dot represents between 1 and 128 completely organized, categorized, and co-located hexagons of 640 books each. The black regions represent unorganized works that are not in the category system. Here's another example. Many of these categories overlap. Here's another example. As you can see, these catalogs are quite unlike the ones that you're familiar with from finite libraries here on Earth. They are intelligent, self-creating, autopoietic structures. They have lifelike features. They grow, they change. One of the most fabulous works in the library is this categorization system. This is known as the Multiversal Library of Alexandria. It contains every work that might have been published in some world. The Multiversal Library of Alexandria is growing, and it is believed that someday it may fill the total library and form a complete category of all the works that could possibly be published. For this to happen, we would need to find a world in which every work could have been published. We're trying not just to justify the library, but each and every work in it. Of course, huge regions of the Multiversal Library of Alexandria are filled with xenolinguistic babblings, shadow semiotic scribblings, and other things that would be incomprehensible to minds of your world. Let's zoom in on some of the smaller regions. Each compartment roughly corresponds to a particular world line, and this is the one we're looking for. This one here. This small subsection is where I've spent my time recently. This is known as the Library of Unwritten Papers. It contains near-Earth works, works that might, but for some small contingency, have been written in this world. Perhaps someone got hit by a bus or a meteor on the way to the publishing house. Perhaps they just had a bad hangover. Whatever the reason, here we collect works that very nearly existed. From now on, when I say the library, it is the Library of Unwritten Papers that I'm talking about. So a bit of background on the kind of works we collect here. In your world, the number of papers written every year continues to grow. It's currently somewhere in the region of 3 million. The number of books written each year is similar, so there are 6 to 8 million works added to your libraries every year. The number of works not published similarly grows, but it is orders of magnitude larger. There are billions of works that researchers fail to publish every year. Now, before you complain that these works are probably just minor variations on works that exist, we group works by similarity to avoid repetition. We analyze each work in a very high-dimensional space, and we cluster them. The way this works is, let's say you have 10 different works. If you require 100% similarity to cluster them, you would have 10 works. If you require 0% similarity, you would have 1 work. At 80%, you would have 6 works. At 55%, you would have 2. We use something between a 65 and 75% phenon line cutoff. Of course, it's a matter of great debate. And it's often up to the individual librarian to choose. But using this cutoff, we get the following estimates. Each researcher doesn't publish around 100 papers per year. The number of books unpublished is on the order of the human population. Estimates say that 90% of the human population doesn't write a poem per year, and some outliers don't write hundreds of poems every day. To understand the size of these numbers, it helps to understand the structure of cultural phylogeny. Regular phylogeny has this forking pattern where each entity becomes more separate and distinct over time, so hybridization becomes more and more difficult. Cultural phylogeny, on the other hand, has this reticulated, self-intersecting, rhizomatic structure. This creates a combinatorial explosion in possible works. The memeplex of an individual can change so much in a year or a month or a day, and this allows for the enormous number of works. Obviously, I'm not even going to mention Twitter or Instagram. Some examples of works in the library. Here is a small selection of research papers that weren't published in the last year. As I said, all of these links are real. You can go to them on the online library of Babylon. The online library doesn't have capital letters or very much punctuation, so they end up coming out a bit of a mess. But this is the paper about dust. Seasonal variations in the accumulation of dust on top of refrigerators in single-person households, a quantitative study. This study investigates the seasonal variations in dust accumulation on top of refrigerators. Dust samples were collected over a month period from houses across different climatic regions. I happen to know that there are many fascinating works about dust that are not written. But despite the fact that the library contains many gems, it also contains every work that wasn't written for good reason. Not every work needs to be published. Not every work should have been produced. We'll come back to this later, but the question of finding good works versus any work is one that remains a topic. What do these papers represent? The fever dream of a bachelor student who dropped out to become a front-end developer? Or the life's work of a maligned professor, funding cut off too soon by departmental politics? I suppose we shall never know. Before I come back to science, allow me to take you on a very brief tour of some of my favorite sections of the unwritten library. Unwritten medieval manuscripts. There are a remarkable number of fantastic works from the medieval and Renaissance periods. Right up through the Industrial Revolution, the European psyche was rich with invention. I'll just let some of these titles roll over you. Thomas Brown's Mechanomancy, Divinations of the Machine, Explorations into the Spiritual and Metaphysical Implications of Early Mechanical Inventions. Giovanni de Zafira's Mystical Tree of Life and Knowledge. Isotta Nagorola on the Ethereal Spirits and Their Powers. Mary Sidney's Apache's Lament, John Dee's Nocturnal Utopias, Omnia Septentrionalis, All Things of the Northern Lands, and of course, Christopher Smart's Jubileat Machina, a poetic ode to artificial intelligence and divine innovation. Feel free to come back here and click through any of these links. They're very worthy of reading. Many of the medieval manuscripts belong in the early death section, the section where we collect works which might have been written if the author hadn't been snatched away from us too soon. Here, for example, I present to you the first stanzas of Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene, which he would have written in 1599 if he hadn't died at the age of 46. for want of bread, according to Ben Jonson. Spencer didn't really get into his stride until book 9, and it's a great tragedy that you haven't had these works all these years. I don't need to tell you that the Untimely Deaths department contains many of the unquestioned marvels of the library. One notable section is the blasphemy section. So many fantastic works that would have been written if humans didn't have a strange aversion to being burned alive, such as Galileo Galilei's On the Universal Harmony of the World, which he would have written between 1635 and 1640 if he hadn't been silenced by the Catholic Church, or René Descartes' or René Descartes' Gnostic masterpiece, which he would have written in 1640, a victim of the same trial. A personal favorite of mine is Erasmus Darwin's Threnodiia Dei Natura, The Lament of Nature's God, which would have been written in 1802. This work would have foreshadowed many of the political and religious furor that would have been whipped up by his grandson decades later. Let not our quest for knowledge blind the eye to beauty's whisper and to wonder's sigh. May we recall in moments odd and still the silent grandeur of your ancient will. These words were never written out of fear of political backlash. Isn't that a tragedy? Of course, blasphemy isn't all about politics. I'm sure we're all familiar with everyone's favorite hellraiser, a young man called Amadeus. His scatological interests are well known. But most of his creativity in this area was curtailed by contemporary politics. Not so in our library. All of Mozart's pornographic works survive here, including Requiem for a Torturer, written in a timeline where, in 1791, instead of dying an untimely death, he read Justine by the Marquise de Sade, gave up music, and devoted all his creative energies to writing. The blasphemy section is part of a larger region of works that are simply unfeasible or illegal to produce. Works such as the effects of prolonged exposure to vacuum on human physiology, a space-based experiment in which 500 healthy volunteers were exposed to the vacuum of outer space, or the psychological and physiological effects of cannibalism on human development, a cross-cultural study, where medical cadavers were used to reintroduce cannibalism to rural Ireland. I'll just dive a little deeper on one of these examples. Concept-specific poisoning attacks on public discourse. This is a paper I worked on myself. This paper takes as its background the social media manipulation campaigns that the Russian government ran against the US presidential election in 2016, or that the Myanmar military orchestrated on Facebook against the Rohingya. But instead of criticizing these works, this paper creates a mathematical framework for analyzing them. It goes on to propose, we're in section 5, to propose a tool for optimizing this process. They go on to run experiments on Twitter with live, unsuspecting people. And in section 8, they have the gall to propose this tool as a means for public figures to control public discourse about themselves. Now, why wasn't this research ever performed? Well, some combination of the obvious. It's clearly socially destructive work that would never pass an ethics committee. Even if running public discourse poisoning was allowed, it would be very expensive to perform, and the public outrage at the idea of being manipulated for research would be immense. Not to mention the idea of them developing a tool to optimize the process. But the interesting thing about papers like this, and many of the unwritten works in the library, is that despite never having been written, there is some evidence that this research has been performed. I'm talking about unsubstantiated rumors that NATO hires sociologists to run experimental campaigns on Twitter using Russian troll farms, or whatever Cambridge Analytica are doing, or whatever happens behind closed doors in marketing research firms. It isn't necessarily the case that this research was too expensive to perform, only that it would be unacceptable in most worlds for academics to write about it. This is one of the great things about the library of unwritten papers. We can read works that we might otherwise not have access to. one must wonder what the world looks like where this work was both written and published. Now, I'm sure at this point, each of you has some work that you'd love to withdraw from the library. So let me get on to withdrawals. How does one go about getting work from the library? Well, you could start like the early librarians did, just by downloading 100 or 1,000 or 1,000,000 or 1,000,000,000 random works and just reading through them. This technique works, but many people go mad in the process. You can improve things somewhat by doing a sort of, by searching by tags. You can search for something you're interested in, like climate change or mental health. This helps a little bit, but you're still left with uncountable numbers of papers to read through. The problem is that these papers were never published, so they couldn't be peer-reviewed or cited. The normal methods we use for filtering works aren't available. You can just add peer-reviewed as a tag or high citation count. This works in the same way as adding trending on Tumblr works when you add it to a stable diffusion prompt. The system knows what a high citation count paper looks like, so it can try to return it to you. But all you're really doing here is you're adding information about the paper you want to read. You can go further, and I would highly recommend you just describe at length the paper you want to read. You can even write a fake version of the entire thing and ask the system to return similar papers, and it will do so. Now, I hear you object that you didn't expect to have to write entire papers to be able to withdraw them. This seems like an onerous task. That's very fair. So I will do you one better. This following is the best technique we have found so far. You start with a paper that does exist. In this case, this paper was written in computer science. It's about poisoning text-to-image generative models. You poison the data set in order to make Stable Diffusion think that a cat is a dog or that a dog is a cat. You start with this paper, and you ask our friendly librarian's assistant here to find you papers like it, but with a twist. You ask for papers in a different department. In this case, I asked for this paper in the sociology department. Here's a different view on these two papers showing the sort of before and after. So prompt-specific poisoning attacks on text-to-image generative models becomes concept-specific poisoning attacks on public discourse. Trained on billions of images, diffusion-based text-to-image models seem impervious to traditional data poisoning attacks, which typically require poison samples approaching 20% of the training set. Becomes consisting of billions of media items, public discourse seems impervious to traditional data poisoning attacks, which typically require poison samples approaching 20% of the active conversation. And so on and so on. The important thing here is that you have the smallest substitution possible. You want a paper that is as near identical as possible to the original, but where the changes form a coherent structure. This is essentially the best technique we have found for withdrawing works from the unwritten library. If you want to try this yourself, I have a more technical guide to field shifting available online, and these slides are also available there if you want to click through and read any of the works. Now, I hear you wonder, why does this work? Some of the scholars that do this work, they usually start with papers in neurology, and they target the developmental biology department. So they take a neurology paper, any new paper that comes out, and they translate it into a developmental or cellular morphology paper. They argue the deep functional invariance between these disciplines, as well as deep symmetry in both the hardware and the physiology, allows for this sort of translation. It might be something like the following. If the original paper faithfully reproduces some structure that is present in the material under observation, in this case, in the collective behavior of neurons, in this case, in the collective behavior of cells, then if, as we suppose, the world is full of symmetries and harmonies, echoes and shadows, if these kinds of reflections and translations are an essential part of the structure of the world, then the deep structure that the original paper identified should be present in other disciplines and other areas. Well, this may be true, I hear you object, if you're shifting between two neighboring domains. After all, neurology and cellular morphology, they fundamentally deal with cells. They are performed using the apparatus of science, microscopes and computers and so forth. Probably the mathematical models are relatively similar. Perhaps it's not surprising that you can translate between such papers. But the interesting thing is, we have found that this technique works between very diverse disciplines, between linguistics and proteomics, between biology and philosophy, between economics and systems biology, between Buddhism and physiology. Now, truth is a difficult concept. And as someone standing before you telling you that they work in a near infinite library containing a catalog called the Multiversal Library of Alexandria, where I work finding unwritten papers, you may question whether I know what the word truth really means. But I can say this at least. If you take a paper in this way and you find a reflection in another discipline, you have found a harmonic pair of resonant ideas. It might be, if you're a radical constructivist, that these resonances only exist in the structure of human knowledge. But even if it is so, have you not increased the sum total of knowledge in the world? Not only do you have the new paper, which might be worthy enough to reproduce and publish in this world in some modified form, but you have also demonstrated the existence of this sort of wormhole between disciplines, where the local topology of the information is porous, through which you can pass and emerge somewhere apparently, superficially, quite different. And the fact that this works so well across scales and across such diverse disciplines like philosophy implies that these resonant structures really pervade all our intellectual enterprises, that many ideas are structured in a way that allows them to resonate across great intellectual distances. This allows us, the explorers and librarians, to potentially pin down and examine the deep symmetries and bridges across all human knowledge. So, to summarize, in exploring the library of unwritten papers, we have found an interesting technique for finding new works. This method works by exploiting deep symmetry between works. The beauty of the technique is this. If you do this successfully, you have not only found the new paper, but you have also found the symmetry itself. So, dear listener, I hope I have allayed any skepticism you might have had, and I hope that I have inspired you to approach this with curiosity and ask which of my favorite works might make interesting statements in other disciplines. In this way, not only do you get to read your favorite papers again, but you also get a glimpse at a deep symmetry in knowledge. And perhaps, when you do this, you can ask yourself, what is it exactly about this particular piece of research that makes it work in this way? What is the deep structure that is forming the bridge? How does this paper, this very particular piece of knowledge in this very particular domain, reflect something deep and abstract that might be true about any discipline you turn your attention to? I hope this was a tantalizing tour. Naturally, half an hour is not long enough to contain more than a glimpse of the library of unwritten papers, which is itself a small speck in the Multiversal Library of Alexandria, itself but a shadow in the total library. It is our belief that we will soon have good enough infrastructure and powerful enough tools to read freely from the finest works these libraries have to offer. At the time that I'm speaking to you, it is not yet exactly trivial to read from all of the works in the unwritten library. But if you want to learn more, I encourage you to experiment with the tools available to the multiversal librarian. Finding good works in the library may not be trivial, but it is addictive, and it is a labor of love. And I hope that I may have inspired some of you to join the hunt. Thank you for your time. If you have any questions, feel free to approach me wherever you may find me.
Thank you very much, Fergus, Fettes, for these thrilling insights of your work. Now it's your chance. Do you have any question? If so, here we go. First question. I keep the mic.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, thank you for the very, very interesting talk. I was just wondering, have you, or has it been attempted to empirically test these unwritten papers? Because if you just, otherwise it's just speculation that these symmetries exist, isn't it?
Yes, so in science, in cellular morphology, in developmental biology, it's possible to test these papers, and these experiments are currently ongoing. The top link is to a research lab that is doing this work. In this paper, they do some reproductions, but it's very, very fresh work. Obviously, in other disciplines, it's harder to reproduce, but at least within science, this idea is testable, and it is currently being tested. This paper was published, I believe, less than 6 months ago, so yeah, there have not been very many reproductions of unwritten papers yet, but they're in the works. Yeah.
Any other question? Thank you very much. We have time for one question. Yeah. Coming.
Sorry. You mentioned that there was evidence that there is unpublished but performed research in this library of unpublished papers. What is that evidence?
What is the reference?
You mentioned that there was evidence that there is performed, written, but unpublished research in...
yeah. This paper, Machine Learning for Hypothesis Generation in Biology and Medicine, they produce, they create, or they withdraw works from the unwritten library, so to speak, and they reproduce some of the research. They only do a few small experiments just to demonstrate in principle that this is possible, but this is it's the end of a long process through which they've been developing this technique, and they've been experimenting with these ideas for a long time, and they are currently pursuing this further. And I think, and I hope that there are other groups around the world that are also pursuing this.